please meet today's guest, Luis Derechin.
Of all the offshore or nearshore projects, 73% are failures. Let that sink in. And 73% are failures. Why?
What if the secret to extending your startup's runway isn't raising more money? It's rethinking where you hire. Welcome to the Designing Successful Startups podcast. I'm your host, Jothy Rosenberg. Today's guest is Luis Derechin, a repeat entrepreneur whose first venture got shut down by the principal's office. He was 11 years old, selling Mexican candy to classmates, and every kid spent their lunch money on his inventory instead of the cafeteria. That early brush with authority didn't slow him down. Luis went on to build JackBe, the first Mexican tech startup to raise U.S. venture capital. And when he realized U.S. salaries were burning through his runway, he discovered something that changed everything. Hiring world-class talent from Latin America at a fraction of the cost. Now he runs NearYou, helping U.S. startups do exactly what saved his company, extend their runway by 60 to 70% while winning the war for talent. This is episode number 100, and Luis brought the heat. Let's get into it. Okay, well, hello, Luis, and thank you for joining me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jothy. I appreciate the fact that you're giving me some time out of your busy schedule.
Oh, well, I love doing this podcast, and I have to tell you something very important. You are number 100 guest. You scored.
I did. Wow. So see, even an even bigger pleasure. Now at least I'll be.
Yeah. So, context setting for the people listening. Where are you originally from, and where do you live now?
A bunch of circles, and I was born in Mexico City, but I was raised in San Diego, California. I then moved back to Mexico, then moved to Washington, D.C., then moved to San Diego. My family now lives in Mexico City, and I spent time in Mexico City, obviously, because my family's here, but I traveled throughout the region. In Colombia, in Argentina, in different places, and then headquarters for the companies in Miami. So I end up spending a fair amount of time.
We're going to talk about your company a whole bunch in a minute. Before the company that you're the founder of, what other small startups were you involved with on the way?
So my first startup, I got in trouble and sent to the principal's office, Jothy, when I was 11 years old, maybe 10. Because I grew up on the border. So San Diego County, the second city, so after the Mexican border, first city, San Isidro, second city is called Chula Vista. I grew up in Chula Vista. And my parents being Mexican and wanting to immerse us in Mexican culture as well as the American culture where we live, they would take us to Tijuana all the time. So I figured I like the Mexican candy. I'll buy a bunch of candy, take it back, and then sell it at school. I didn't know that I wasn't allowed to sell candy in school. So the principal found out when all of the kids spent their lunch money on my candy and not on lunch. So I was sent to the principal's office, and I guess the authorities shut down my first entrepreneurial venture. Ever since then, I'm what some people call a serial entrepreneur. I like repeat entrepreneur, because serial is more, serial murderer than serial entrepreneur. But I think the biggest claim to fame before NearYou was a company called JackBe. And JackBe was the first tech startup in Mexico to raise U.S. venture capital funding. That's what I did previous to the current one.
And you've stayed out of the principal's office and within the law in all of your startups, right?
Well, look, we had some intelligence agencies that were customers back in JackBe. So I spent a fair amount of time, in offices that I can't tell you about. Let's just put it that way.
So the current company is called what?
NearYou, NIR-YU, phonetically. For U.S. folks, maybe it's not second nature, but phonetically it'd be NearYou.
And what does it do? And tell us about,
Sure. What we do is we help U.S. companies, mostly startups and mid-market companies, hire remote talent out of Latin America to work for them, again, remotely. This all came about as a result of my previous company. So one of the things that happened, Jothy, at JackBe, at my previous company, is when we raised the venture funding, which, I thought I was a rock star. All of a sudden I find myself in the US having to pay US wages, and sticker shock hit, right? Because as you know, cost of living in the US is far more expensive than it is in most other places. Therefore, people have to make more money. That's just a reality, an economic reality of life. When I started building out the team in order to attempt to penetrate the US market, I realized that if I built out the entire team that I needed and paid US wages, that the runway for my company would be very short. So as a way to elongate the runway, I started hiring back in Latin America, back home, Mexico, Colombia, whatnot, in order to pay lower wages. This is the early 2000s, mind you. So no Zoom, no Slack, none of those things, right? We were flying by the seat of our pants. And to make a very long story short, we were successful. The company got acquired 13, 14 years later. And then ever since then, I've been helping companies do the same thing that I did for my company, which is hire really good talent, saving them 60 to 70%. And in doing that, either elongating the runway for companies to stay alive longer than they would, or be successful in the war for talent, because finding, hiring talent, paying talent in the US is difficult, it's expensive. So if we can help them by adding another 550 million people that can work remotely for them, then God bless.
So one of the big advantages of using Central and South America compared to all the offshoring that I've ever seen people do is time zone. Talk about that, will you?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Let me just add North America, if I could, because Mexico is geographically in North America. So we don't want to exclude Mexico.
My guilty as charged. My mistake.
No. I hear you. It's I make the same mistake a lot. No worries. So that's why we refer to Latin America, right? Latin America being all of the countries that have Latin heritage, which is almost all of America. I think there are a couple of colonies that were Dutch, one that was English, right? Belize and whatnot. So those would be excluded from Latin America. But I'm getting into too much geographic detail. So to answer your question, when offshoring started back in the day, India was the biggest recipient. I believe it still is. They're the biggest provider of offshore services. And basically companies initially in Europe would hire Indian engineers or Indian staff to provide services for them. Then American companies started doing that. But as communications became more real time, what started happening is the waterfall methodology that was used for software planning and just throwing a bunch of documents over and having people work on them for days, weeks, months, and then send back a project started turning into what's called agile methodology. And agile methodology is more constant communication, review, more interaction, shall I say. Interacting between individuals that are anywhere from 11 to 16 hours difference is difficult. That's just a reality of life. So one of two things would happen. One of three things. You would either force the service provider to work strange hours in order to acquiesce to the time zone of the company that was paying the bills, which is typically what happened. The circadian rhythm and other things that's not sustainable for the long term. Second, the second option, you would have the person, the project manager or product manager that would be working off hours in order to accommodate to the IT, the services vendor hours. Or what started happening is they all of a sudden realized, hey, there's another geography. We don't have to send it to Eastern Europe or India or Pakistan or Philippines. We could actually leverage the fact that there is a very large population in Latin America and we can have real-time communication. Mexico is Central Standard Time, right? With the west coast of Mexico being Pacific Standard Time. And you even have some Eastern Standard Time, Cancun and all that. And then, as you go down in Latin America, it tends to be maybe 2 hours difference if you go to the easternmost part of Uruguay or Argentina versus Eastern. So the fact that the time zones are very, very similar, allows people to have conversations like you and I are having now. You're in Boston, I'm in Mexico City, but we can have these things and you're not, late at night or early in the morning, and neither am I.
There's an approach that a lot of people that I knew, yes, they were doing agile development, and yes, they were using staff in India, and I think they were trying to convince me that this was a great idea, but in reality, and I'll tell you what the idea is, but in reality, I think they were just desperately trying to make it work. And so what a lot of people did was they would have the team in India work their normal hours and do a bunch of development. And as they wrap up for the day and they are checking things into the source code repository, they would send a message each day, probably the project manager there would, and say, here's what we did, or here's how much we accomplished of the tasks that we're assigned. And the people are getting up somewhere in the US and they read what happened and they look over the code. And then it's a very challenging set of balls to juggle, because then they're trying to do their part, adding on to the stuff that was written while they were asleep. And then the opposite happens as they go to bed and the Indian people are starting to wake up. Sustaining that is just, it's exhausting for me to describe it.
Jyoti, so the answer is yes, but there are companies that got the hang of it perfectly, right? And there are companies that love the 24/7 cycle of constant development. In my experience, those tend to be larger companies with, a lot more structure, a lot more predefined roles, a lot more staff. So that's why when you ask what we do, we tend to focus on startups, right? Ambitious startups and in mid-market companies, because what ends up happening, and this from your journey, your professional journey, as well as a lot of people, 99 other guests that you have interviewed, smaller companies look to larger companies and try to initially mimic what they're doing and then sort of fix it. A lot of companies try doing what you just described, Jothy, right? So if these large companies are doing the 24/7 development, then I can do it. And it's far more sustainable for them than it is for you, because you don't have the staff, you don't have the wherewithal. So what I would point to, it's not that those types of engagements can't be successful. They certainly can. But for startups and mid-market companies, we have found that those tend to be failures far more often than successes. And one of the bigger challenges is the offset in time zones. Yes.
Hi, the podcast you are listening to is a companion to my recent book, Tech Startup Toolkit: How to Launch Strong and Exit Big. This is the book I wish I'd had, as I was founding and running 8 startups over 35 years. I tell the unvarnished truth about what went right, and especially about what went wrong. You could get it from all the usual booksellers. I hope you like it. It's a true labor of love. Now back to the show. All right, so time zone is one thing. But another thing is that I find that the big companies have plenty of tasks that are maybe not the core, really innovative part of the product. That they're farming those out to someone offshore. But the startup, there's probably no code that they're writing that is simple, trivial, unimportant, maybe. And so you need really good people, and you need them to be well integrated because all the parts matter. And so, I know a ton of people that tried offshoring to India or China or even Eastern Europe and ended up pulling back, or they figured out that, okay, there are some things that are not sort of core, hard, innovative technology, the things that you might end up filing patents on. So maybe give me your reactions to some of that.
No, look, I think what you're saying has a lot of truth behind it. Now, I'm sure if we were to talk to someone that provides services from those offshore locations, they would say that either the person doing the work or the product manager, product owner, sort of shift their time zones, and depending on where you are, they can make it work. And again, I don't want to knock them because a lot of time they can. But what we have found, Jothy, is that the more real time collaboration that is needed, the less time zone shift that can exist. A, B, the more cultural adherement or cultural similarity that is required. And again, it's no knock on anyone, but Mexico and the US have been interchanging cultures for hundreds of years. So the fact that we're so close, we sort of understand each other a bit more naturally than someone from, the Far East, the Indian subcontinent, or even Eastern Europe. So I would say that what we have found is, and this is not only our research, but there's plenty of research about the number that I'm about to provide to you, is of all the offshore or nearshore projects, 73% are failures, right? Let that sink in. And 73% are failures. Why? There are a bunch of reasons. We've done work on this for many years, and we've identified 7 components of the death trap, right? So when a project is stuck, we call it the offshore team death trap, because you have a team that's offshore, you think things are going to go swimmingly, and then you end up being in this death trap where it slows, withers away and dies, sometimes not so slowly. So things like cultural chasm, where the person you hire isn't as culturally adept as your team needs him or her to be. There is communication fog, whether it's because of time zone or because of accent or language barriers. There's the hidden cost spiral, right? Because when you hire someone, you don't know exactly how much they're going to cost, or what the total cost is going to be. I can go through the 7 of them, but long story short is what you're saying is correct. The fact that you're sort of trusting and hoping that things go well, it's almost a recipe for failure. What you need is a framework for success. And the book that I just published, The Offshore Team Death Trap, analyzes the 7 components of the death trap and then provides a framework called the Remote Intelligence Framework. Remote being an acronym. I'll go through the acronym in a little bit, but it's a framework that companies can follow in order to go from only 27% success rates to about 95% success rates. So if by reading a book you can X the possibilities of success, it's great news.
That is great news. So one other thing that I always worry about when I'm using someone who's well, yeah, not local and not, they might be considered contractors depending on how you hire this remote team. So, and the thing I worry about is you don't want to lose really core knowledge that, you're like one of the reasons that we have, vesting on stock options is because you don't want people who are core to your team and their brain is getting full of, really valuable knowledge about the problem you're solving and how your technology works, et cetera, et cetera. And you don't want them walking out the door with all that knowledge. And so you come up with ways to retain them. So, the whole vesting where there's a 1-year cliff, you certainly don't want anybody to leave in the first year because they haven't contributed anything yet and walk away with a bunch of options. I feel like you have a solution for this because I worry about it. So you've probably worried about it, and you've got a book and you've got a company that helps solve it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
So if most companies that hire don't hire thinking, unless these are temporary hires, which I'll put in a separate bucket, but most companies that hire don't go in thinking, gee, I'm going to hire for the short term, give this person a lot of knowledge, and then have the person walking out the door. But it's not the way you hire, and when I say the way is, employees, contractors, brand them however you want. It's the intention with which you hire. It's how you treat the individuals. It's the type of respect, communication, integration that you give to the individuals. So what we have found, Jothy, is that in the remote intelligence framework, there's first, the R stands for rigorous talent selection. So when you hire someone that is going to be working outside of your company's geographic confines, you have to be even more rigorous than if you were hiring them to work shoulder to shoulder with you, because you're going to have to trust that this person does work 1,000 miles away, right? Or 2,000 miles away, and that the person is going to be able to contribute. You have to, the E stands for expert onboarding and integration. You have to dedicate the time to integrate the person into your culture, making sure that they feel like they're part of the company. And then the M stands for managed support and services. You have to provide the right level of support and service that you would. So without going into the other three letters, which we'll cover in a second, just those three hint at the what I will call the intentionality with which individual workers have to be hired, and especially more if they're going to be hired remotely. If you hire someone shoulder to shoulder, people sort of live the culture, live and breathe it every day. You're shoulder to shoulder. If you do something that you shouldn't be doing, the person has the desk next door or the office next door is going to knock on your door and say, "Hey, Jothy, we don't do things like that here." Whereas if a person is going to work remotely, you need to have the communication loop to be able to provide feedback. You need to explain expectations a lot more. You need to make sure that the person feels a lot more entrenched and identifies with the company. And all those things require intentionality from the moment you interview, the moment you hire, the moment you onboard, and then the moment you communicate. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned communication, because if they're not part of the weekly all hands, if they're not getting a lot of communication, not just from the direct manager, but from the CEO, because I like to think about it this way: a startup that doesn't have to pivot is a well, they're either very lucky or just incredibly smart. But I've almost always had to pivot, and sometimes it's not like a big pivot. We're changing our business model. Sometimes it's we learned something about the product, and we have to adapt to that. And it's hard work making sure you've explained that to everybody, and you have to explain it over and over, because they kind of got used to the way things were, and you're changing it. And anything you change, no matter how little, you at a startup, this is a small number of people.
Yes, small number of people, large number of tasks, and like you said, most are going to have to pivot. And sometimes they're not, company making pivots. Sometimes it's a series of smaller pivots, right? In your positioning, it's the use of a word, it's the way that you sell, it's the way that you present, right? It's the sales engineer that instead of starting out with this part of the demo should start with this part of the demo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the need for constant communication, to me, is absolutely a must-have in startups and in mid-market companies. And the fact that more communication is needed in real time and having the exchange of opinions, it's not top down, right? You've been in these situations, worked for startups and advised many companies. You know that sometimes it's bottom up, sometimes it's top down, sometimes it's side to side. But the only way that you make this flourish is by having constant communication from every person that is involved in the product. And we've spoken a lot about technology, but it doesn't have to be technology. It can be in the product, it can be in customer support, it can be marketing, it can be in the legal team, it can be in all these teams. Because today remote work is done not only for tech jobs, but for numerous jobs. But the one constant is the intentionality with which you hire people, right? Interview, you onboard them, and then the constancy with which you're always communicating, because that's the only way that startups or mid-market companies are going to be successful.
And by the way, we just did a full circle, because how do you do an all hands if you're not in a very close time zone?
I've seen them done. People at 1 a.m. are sitting there with their coffee, waiting for the 9 a.m. call, right? That starts elsewhere. Can it be done? Yes, but for Smaller companies that don't have the infrastructure, don't have the multiple levels of management and whatnot, very difficult to do. Yes.
That's
And frankly, look,
yeah. I mean,
you know this, a startup or mid-market company, it's difficult enough as it is. Why, add that layer of difficulty, right? Just if you want to hire less expensive, then try nearshore instead of offshore.
listen, when I hold weekly all hands at all my companies up until we get to like 45, 50 people, we usually have a single room we could do it in. This is all pre-COVID. And even so, to entice people to come to the meeting and be on time, I bake muffins for everybody. And food is an amazing motivator for people. And then I had remote people, and I felt bad, and I would say, listen, I can't really ship you muffins because they won't be
Stale.
yummy by then. So I'm sorry. You can either enjoy watching us eat our muffins, or I'll send you recipes if you want. But anyway, so tell us the other three letters.
So the O stands for optimized team performance. And this goes again to the communication. So once you communicate, you onboard someone with intentionality, you make them part of the team by making sure that they understand what they have to achieve, and then having a feedback loop where you're actually tracking performance and making sure that that performance is achieved. The T is sort of transparent cost plus pricing. And that one I think is equally important. The person that is doing the work, you want the management of the company for whom they're working to understand whether that person is making a fair wage. Typically, as a way to sort of shortcut hiring in another country, a lot of companies rely on third-party service providers. And there are two types, at least in my experience, of third-party service providers. There are those that are going to offer a black box pricing service where they're going to say, we're going to charge you $23 per hour for a Java developer with, three years of experience, and that's great. So the company that's doing the hiring understands the budget and understands sort of the boundaries. But the problem is, you don't ask how much the person doing the work is going to make. And out of those $23, the person may be making 8, 10, 11. And he or she feels exploited. And then over time, the relationship isn't going to be perfectly aligned. Because if you're paying your staff in the US bonuses, or there's a reward for something that the whole company achieved, and the person that is doing the work nearshore or offshore isn't participating in those rewards, in the bonuses and everything, then the person starts saying, well, am I part of this team or aren't I part of the team? So for me, the T in transparency isn't, it's one more layer of that communication and the ability for the manager to talk to the person doing the work about how much the person is getting paid, the person that's doing the work, if they want a raise, if they need a raise, being able to talk to the company to whom they're providing services, instead of having a third person that is always trying to bill more for the work and pay less for the person that's doing the work. And lastly, the E is for enhanced scalability and growth. And that's sort of a result of the other 5. If you're rigorous about selecting talent, if you're intentional about the way that you onboard people expertly, if you provide the right level of support and services, if you optimize the performance of your team, and if you're able to have this transparency with the wages, what results is enhanced scalability and growth.
How do you deal with the fact that as much as we would like people not to share what their salary is with their colleagues, how do you deal with the fact that, because you just talked about, are the people that are remote and the people that are local getting the same fairness? Is the bonus structure, rewards, whatever, is it fair? And yeah, obviously that's important. But one of your starting statements at the beginning of this podcast was, well, one of the big benefits of doing this is your runway is going to be longer because your costs are lower. But so how do you deal with the fact that this person sitting in Mexico is saying, salary information with the person sitting in San Diego,
Right.
and then they're going to say, well, wait, you're making almost twice what I make. And yeah, you go, well, wait a minute, how much is your rent? How much
Correct.
is your mortgage?
Correct.
And maybe that works, but they're still probably going to whine about it.
I find that, first of all, when I say transparency, I don't mean commonality in the fact that everyone's talking wages, right? I mean, you still want to compartmentalize. So the person that is doing the work is going to share wages, with the person that's doing the hiring, with managers, not necessarily with their peers. So first of all, right?
We hope. You hope they aren't.
Well, correct, correct. But then I'll also say that most people that are doing work remotely understand that part of why they have the work, that the remote work, is because they're going to be making less than their peers in the US. And they're conscious and they don't whine so much about it because the cost of living in Latin America is much lower, right? A mortgage in the US is going to run you 1,000, couple thousand, 3, 4, 5,000, depending on where you live, right? Is it, Mississippi, or is it Palo Alto? So the fact that a person makes more in the US doesn't necessarily mean that they have a better quality of life. Sometimes in Latin America, making 30% because you don't have a mortgage, right? Because you have your own home that you were able to buy for tens of thousands of dollars. Tens of thousands of dollars, you could buy an entire home here. Not all homes, that there are also homes that are hundreds of thousands, but still, a medium class dwelling is $50,000 to $120,000. Mortgages
Wow.
tend to be a lot smaller. Health insurance. I'll give you an example. So health insurance for an entire family in Latin America will probably run you, depending on the health plan, will probably run you $200 to $400 per month. Compare that with health insurance in the US, right? The deductibles, right, are going to be tiny compared to the US. So the cost of living in the US is so expensive that people in the US need to make that much money in order to live the same type of quality life that people in Latin America making 30 to 40% of what US individuals make. Therefore, I would almost say that the workers doing the work down here feel blessed and privileged because they'll be making more than if they worked for a local company. I think they compare themselves more to their next door neighbor, right? And how much their next door neighbor is making than comparing themselves to their peer who lives in Palo Alto, because it's incomparable. It's mentally infeasible for that comparison to occur.
I hope you're enjoying the show. In addition to the podcast, you might also be interested in the online program I have created for startup founders called Who Says You Can't Startup. In it, I've tried to capture everything I've learned in the course of founding and running 9 startups over 37 years, with no constraints like there were with my book. The program is 4 courses, each one about 15 video lessons, plus over 30 high-value downloadable resources. The QR code will take you where you can learn more. Tell us what parts of this whole picture your company does. Are you helping them find the people? Are you helping them stay within the local laws, which are hard to keep track of because they're different everywhere? And what are all the things that you guys do?
So the answer is yes to all of those. Um, my company specializes in helping U.S. companies find the talent, right? So we help them go through a rigorous talent selection. We immerse ourselves in our talent acquisition professionals in not only the job descriptions, but the company's culture, communication patterns, type of accent that you need. It's very different if a person's going to be, chat Spanish than conversational English. And we find the talent. We then help a company onboard and integrate the talent. We then provide the right level of support and services in country, whether it's in Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, wherever they may be hiring. And as you indicated, we make sure that they steer right of all the laws that have to be obeyed, right? Regulations, rules, laws for tax purposes, for liability purposes, intellectual property ownership purposes. And then we help them optimize team performance, even though we're not responsible for deliveries, right? Or the constant performance. We do participate in creating feedback loops, making sure that, as you said, either the all hands happen or there are constant communication that is happening with them. And we do all this with the transparent cost plus pricing structure. So, as you look at the acronym that we created, we sort of eat our own home cooking by obeying the REMOT as part of our business model.
So, a normal person recruiter in the U.S. is going to get maybe 30% of the person's first year salary. That's their business model.
Correct.
What parts do you? I assume you get that, but
we don't. So our business model is when we work with a U.S. company in order to find them talent. First of all, we don't get paid anything until the person is actually hired, starts working. So it's zero risk for our U.S. client. And then when we find the person, we don't charge anything upfront, 10, 20, 30% of wages. We don't believe in that. We believe that we're partners in the business model. And because of that, we will say, this is Jose, and Jose fits the job description and we think it's talented enough. And then we let the company know what are the wage expectations that Jose, or obviously whoever. So each resume goes along with the expected wages or the wage expectations that each person has. It's part of the transparency. And then we will agree that if and when the person's hired, our U.S. company bills our U.S. customer in order to make sure that the terms and conditions and liabilities are between a U.S. company and another U.S. company. And then we take care of payroll from the U.S. down. So we use our companies in Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, wherever we are, in order to pay these individuals, making sure that we're compliant with, again, local regulations, whatnot. And we pre-negotiate a flat fee, not a percentage, but a fee of a few $100s per month per person in order to manage payroll, manage the legal, provide the type of support that you need, and all the other services that we've spoken about. So it's actually very cost effective.
It's okay. So that's brilliant, because now you've got annual recurring revenue that you can predict.
For us, yes, but we also have annual recurring revenue or annual recurring expenses that our customers understand. They're able to budget correctly. They're also able to better understand the price quality gap, right? Or price quality relationship. Sound good. So it's the best way to align everyone, right? If a person happens to leave, right? We're often asked, so what kind of guarantee do you give us that you're going to find someone else if a person leaves? And my answer is, well, if a person leaves, I stop making money. So it's in my best interest to find someone that is, compliant with everything you need, because I don't charge anything unless I have people working. So yeah, we see our relationships, instead of vendor or service provider and client, we actually strive to create deep partnerships where we participate in the success and the constancy of the growth, right? And they get to have people that are making them or want to be part of their success. Does that make sense? It's about aligning.
No, it's great. It's really great. So I'm guessing you have to travel a lot.
I do, but I love it. I love it. It's I going back to my the story where I sold candy. My next job, or the first company I created, was with my father. I created an import-export company. Finally, when the borders in Mexico were open to imports, we would buy housewares all over the world and then bring them into Mexico. And my father was an incredible salesperson. So he would stay in Mexico and sell these things. And imagine I'm 19, 20, and I'm traveling the world buying housewares in order to send them back to Mexico so that my father would sell. So I've had experiences, alone in Turkey in midnight, right? Or in India and in Europe, going to a bunch of fairs. So ever since then, I've loved traveling, being part of cultures, being able to see different cultures, how they react to different things. So for me, it's not a burden. It really is a pleasure.
You must wear out the passports.
It's funny because when I do get to the borders, the border guards flips a page, then another, then another. And I sit there and I chuckle, right? And I usually get my passports with 10-year expirations. And I haven't had one where I haven't had to go back to the passport office and get a new one because the page, all the pages were stamped on. Correct.
I guess they don't let you put loose pieces of paper in.
There are countries that do that.
I see.
There are, like Cuba. I'll give you a quick example. I actually went to Cuba years ago to see if there was the potential to hire talent, and they don't stamp your passport. They give you a separate page because in some countries, the fact that you visited Cuba is shunned upon. So you get to take that page and throw it out, and no one knows that you were there.
Wow, that's funny. This has been great. I have one last question for you. Okay. And it's not about your company. And it's this. If you think about the word grit, where and I believe I've never seen a startup person who doesn't have a lot of grit. And I think of the word grit as the descriptors are resilience, stick-to-itiveness, focus, determination, a few other words like that. What is your source of grit?
You know, it's on the surface, it's a very easy question, but it's one of the more complex because I think it changes over time, right? When we first start a company, you know, I know very few people that don't go into this thinking they're going to be a success, right? Here's the next unicorn. I'm going to create the next unicorn. And then you sort of realize, well, maybe unicorn was overhyping it. So the motivation that was there to create a billion-dollar valuation company sort of shifts, right? And you may get smaller in your desired in your desired growth, but then you start realizing the impact that you can make in different markets. So my source of grit, I think it goes back to the people that I work with, the objectives that I set for myself. Obviously, I want to be economically successful. I know of no entrepreneur that goes into it thinking, I'm doing this because I want to be less well off than I am today. So it's economic benefit, it's family, right? It's the ability to provide a better life for my family, my children. It's the ability to work, in my case, with people that are working in other countries that I can see how they improve their lifestyles and their families. But that stick-to-itiveness, I think it's you said it, it's determination, it's stubbornness, but ultimately it's thinking that what you're doing really matters to you and to others.
But it goes back to childhood too, right? I mean, you were a little 11-year-old and you attempted to do your first startup. So there's maybe a deeper source of grit than just, the various companies that you've had and the people around you. I'm kind of looking for the root source of the strength and toughness. Maybe the word I left out was toughness.
Look, I saw my father was a certified public accountant, and that sounds incredibly boring. But what he did is he started his own firm, right, in order to grow. And I saw the ups and downs, and that's just how I lived my life. So, am I reliving patterns that I was taught? I guess if a shrink was to listen to me, they'd probably say, I was mimicking that. But there's a cultural aspect. There is a personality, right? Everyone talks about the type A personality. I can't remember not being competitive. I hated to lose, Jothy. Hated to lose, right? I remember hearing Sir Alex Ferguson, who managed Manchester United through their heyday, right? The best period that Manchester United ever had. He's the one who managed them. And he would say that when he went to scout young players, he loved seeing who were the players that cried if a team lost. Because you knew that deep down that kid hated losing so much that he would work his tail off to never lose again. So, I think it just forms part of who we are as entrepreneurs. I don't want to say that everyone cries when they lose, but I did.
I buy that 100%. It resonates with me. Yeah. And I have a childhood source of grit. And it's when something really terrible happens, in my case, losing a leg and a lung to cancer, and having to figure out how to live again and how to rebuild one's self-esteem And then once you do that, and I did a TED talk on how I did that, and this other book is about that, which is called Who Says I Can't? And
See,
that it's you can see me on the cover and there's a leg missing. So it's about fighting back against something that's holding you down. And if you succeed at that, which I did, now you're set for all kinds of other challenges. I mean, my startups have not been easy. I was not blessed with a bunch of easy ones. I had one easy one, only one. All the rest were really hard, including this current one, which has been a disappointment. And it's my 9th one, and it's my last one. I'm not going to do anymore.
you think?
Well, okay, but I don't think of this podcast as a business, but it is a thing, and I'm creating an online set of online courses for startup founders. So I've got a triumvirate going, which is sort of turning into a thing. The book, the podcast, and the online courses are all about startup founders. And I hope to do mentoring of startup CEOs as well. And kind of that's my next thing. And I'll do that as long as I can.
That's a great way to give back and B, create a lot of value. So just to finish off on what you were saying, first of all, thank you for sharing. I'll be honest, I did not know your story, and that's very inspirational. So thank you for sharing it. Look, I think to what you said is we're all stuck, or we're all going to face obstacles, and whether you let the obstacle defeat you or not is up to each individual. And I have found that those that are incredibly competitive tend to be entrepreneurial in spirit, right? And it goes with the personality. We're competitive, hyper competitive. We're hyper aware of what's going on, and we feel like we want to make a difference. That, I think, summarizes what you said. The people that you're mentoring, I'll put myself sort of in that category, and many of my friends who are also entrepreneurs.
Well, that's a great way to end this very entertaining and I think valuable episode for our audience, which is entrepreneurs of all sorts. So thank you very much,
Jothy. Once again, I'm the one who's thankful that you shared the space with me.
And here are your toolkit takeaways. Toolkit number 1: your runway is a hiring problem, not just a fundraising problem. Luis discovered that building his U.S. team at U.S. wages would have killed his company. By hiring exceptional talent from Latin America, he extended his runway dramatically without raising another dollar. Before you chase more funding, ask yourself if there's a smarter way to build your team. Toolkit number 2: time zones matter more than you think. Offshoring to India or Eastern Europe sounds great until you're taking calls at midnight or losing days to asynchronous handoffs. Latin America operates in real time with U.S. companies. That means agile actually works, and your team feels like one team. Toolkit number 3: grit comes from hating to lose. Luis talked about legendary coach Sir Alex Ferguson scouting kids who cried when their team lost, because that fire meant they'd never stop fighting. Ask yourself, do you hate losing enough to push through when it gets hard? Now go look at your org chart and your burn rate and ask yourself, is there a smarter way to build this team? And that is our show with Luis. The show notes contain useful resources and links. Please follow and rate us at podchaser.com/designing successful startups. Also, please share and like us on your social media channels. This is Jothy Rosenberg saying, TTFN, ta-ta for now.